The morning air held a crisp chill as Officer Karen Reynolds pulled into the parking lot of Sunrise Coffee, a popular spot in downtown Oak Ridge. She was already in a foul mood. The call had come in just as she was finishing her paperwork from an earlier domestic disturbance. Something about a suspicious person making other customers uncomfortable. These calls were almost always nothing, just some paranoid citizen with too much time on their hands. Reynolds adjusted her uniform and checked her reflection in the rearview mirror. 12 years on the force had hardened her face into permanent lines of suspicion. At 43, she'd seen enough to know that people were rarely what they seemed. She prided herself on her instincts, on being able to spot trouble before it happened. "Dispatch, I'm 1023 at Sunrise Coffee." She spoke into her radio as she stepped out of her patrol car. 10-4, Officer Reynolds. The bell above the door jingled as she entered. The coffee shop was busy for a Tuesday morning. A mix of college students with laptops, business people in press suits, and the usual assortment of locals filled the tables. Reynolds scanned the room, her eyes eventually settling on a black man in a button-down shirt and slacks, sitting alone at a corner table with 2 phones on the table in front of him. Something about him immediately rubbed her the wrong way. He was too well dressed for this neighborhood, too calm. And why 2 phones? In her experience, only drug dealers and cheating spouses carried 2 phones. The barista, a young woman with blue-streaked hair, waved Reynolds over. "Officer, thanks for coming so quickly." "That's him in the corner," she whispered, nodding toward the man Reynolds had already noticed. "He's been here for almost 2 hours, barely touched his coffee, and keeps looking around like he's waiting for someone. A couple of our regulars said they felt uncomfortable." Reynolds nodded. "I'll handle it." She approached the table with the confident stride she'd perfected over years of confrontations. The man looked up, his expression neutral but attentive. "Sir, I need to speak with you," Reynolds said, her hand resting casually near her holster, a habit more than a conscious decision. The man nodded politely. "Of course, officer. Is there a problem?" His voice was deeper than she'd expected, with the kind of refined accent that suggested education. It irritated her even more. "I've received reports of suspicious behavior. You've been sitting here for hours, barely consuming anything, watching people. Care to explain?" The man's eyebrows rose slightly. "I've been waiting for someone, officer. I ordered a large coffee and a muffin when I arrived." He gestured to the empty plate and half-full mug beside his phones. "I don't believe that's against the law." Reynolds felt her irritation grow at his calm response. People were supposed to be nervous around police. The fact that he wasn't triggered something in her. "I'm going to need to see some ID," she said, her tone hardening. The man sighed, reaching slowly toward his back pocket. "I'm actually—" "Hands where I can see them," Reynolds snapped, her hand now firmly on her weapon. The coffee shop fell silent. Every eye in the place turned toward their corner. "Officer, I was reaching for my identification," the man said, his hands now raised slightly. "I'm Special Agent Thomas Washington with the FBI. I'm here on official business." Reynolds let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Yeah, right. And I'm the Attorney General. Let's try again, shall we?" "ID," slowly. Washington's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "My credentials are in my back pocket. I'm going to reach for them very slowly." "Sure thing, Agent," Reynolds said, putting mocking emphasis on the title. Under her breath, but still audible to those nearby, she added, "Always trying to be something they're not." Several customers exchanged uncomfortable glances. An older woman at the next table looked appalled. Washington moved with deliberate slowness, reaching back to retrieve a leather wallet. As he began to open it, Reynolds drew her weapon, pointing it directly at him. "I said slowly," she barked. The coffee shop erupted in gasps and murmurs. A college student knocked over a chair, scrambling to move away from the confrontation. "Officer, my credentials are right here," Washington said, his voice remaining steady despite having a gun pointed at him. He carefully opened the wallet to reveal an FBI badge and ID card. "I'm conducting surveillance as part of an ongoing federal investigation. I was waiting for an informant." Reynolds didn't lower her weapon. Anyone can buy a fake badge online, these days. A heavy-set man in his 60s stood up from a nearby table. "Officer, I think you need to calm down. He's just showing you ID like you asked." "Stay out of this, sir," Reynolds snapped, not taking her eyes off Washington. "Call your supervisor," Washington suggested calmly. "Or I can call mine. This situation is escalating unnecessarily." Reynolds felt sweat beading on her forehead. Something wasn't right. This man was too composed, too professional. But if he really was FBI, "Put the badge on the table and step back," she ordered. Washington complied, placing his credentials on the table and taking a single step backward, hands still visible. A young woman at a window table had her phone out, recording the entire incident. Reynolds noticed but couldn't address it without taking her attention off Washington. "Now call whoever you need to call to verify," Washington said. "But I suggest you lower your weapon first. This is becoming a public spectacle." "Don't tell me how to do my job," Reynolds snarled. But doubt was creeping in. What if he really was FBI? She'd be in serious trouble. The door to the coffee shop opened and another officer walked in. Joe Ramirez, Reynolds' patrol partner for the last 3 years. "Karen, what's going on?" Ramirez asked, taking in the scene with obvious alarm. "This man claims he's FBI," Reynolds said, not lowering her weapon. "Says he's here on some surveillance operation." Ramirez approached cautiously and glanced at the credentials on the table. His eyes widened. "Karen, these look legitimate," he said quietly. "Maybe we should—" "Oh, you're taking his side now?" Reynolds interrupted, her voice rising. "Just because he waves some badge around?" "Officer Reynolds," Washington said, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Your partner is right. I am a federal agent conducting official business. By interfering and drawing your weapon, you're now obstructing a federal investigation. I strongly suggest you holster your weapon before this gets any worse for you." Several more customers had their phones out now, recording the confrontation. The coffee shop manager had emerged from the back looking panicked. "Should I call 911? He asked no one in particular. "We are 911, Ramirez replied tensely. Then to Reynolds, "Karen, put the gun down. This isn't worth your career." Something in his tone finally reached her. Reynolds lowered her weapon slightly, but her expression remained defiant. "Let me see that ID again," she demanded. Washington gestured to the credentials still on the table. "They haven't changed in the last 2 minutes." Ramirez picked up the badge wallet and examined it closely, before handing it back to Washington with an apologetic nod. "It's legitimate," he confirmed to Reynolds. "Special Agent Thomas Washington, FBI." Reynolds finally holstered her weapon, but her posture remained rigid with anger and embarrassment. "Well, Agent Washington, maybe next time don't act so suspicious in public places. We've had drug activity in this area." Washington reclaimed his credentials with a steady hand. "Officer Reynolds, I'll need your badge number and the name of your supervising officer." "Are you threatening me?" Reynolds demanded. "I'm following procedure," Washington replied evenly. "When a local officer interferes with a federal agent conducting official business, it gets reported. When that officer draws a weapon on a federal agent without just cause, it becomes a serious matter." Ramirez stepped between them. "Agent Washington, on behalf of the department, I apologize for this misunderstanding. Officer Reynolds has been under a lot of stress lately." "That's not an excuse for racial profiling or excessive force," Washington said firmly. "Racial profiling?" Reynolds exploded. "Don't play that card with me. I responded to a call about suspicious behavior, which is my job." The coffee shop had become uncomfortably quiet again, every customer watching the drama unfold. The young woman who had been recording approached cautiously. "I have the whole thing on video," she said, addressing Washington, including what she said under her breath. Reynolds turned on her, face flushed with anger. "Nobody asked you to get involved. Hand over that phone right now." "That's enough." Ramirez grabbed Reynolds' arm as she moved toward the woman. "Karen, you need to step outside and cool off now." For a moment it seemed Reynolds might refuse. Then, with a final glare at Washington, she stormed out of the coffee shop. "I'll be filing a formal complaint," Washington told Ramirez. "And based on what just happened, I suspect I won't be the first." Outside, Reynolds leaned against her patrol car, heart pounding. She knew she'd messed up badly this time. As customers began to file out of the coffee shop, many deliberately avoiding eye contact with her, she saw the young woman who had been recording showing her phone to Washington. In that moment, Reynolds realized her career might be over, all because she couldn't believe a black man could actually be an FBI agent. The weight of what she'd done began to sink in, but rather than remorse, all she felt was bitter resentment. She'd been doing her job protecting people. How was she supposed to know? The morning sunshine felt suddenly harsh and accusing as Ramirez emerged from the coffee shop, his expression making it clear that the worst was yet to come. By noon, the video had already racked up over 50,000 views. Lily Chen, the college student who had recorded the confrontation at Sunrise Coffee, had posted it to her social media accounts before she even left the shop. Within an hour, local news stations were calling her for permission to use the footage. Never expected it to blow up like this, Lily told her roommate as they watched the view counter climb on her phone. I just knew something wrong was happening and wanted proof. The video captured everything. Officer Reynolds approaching Agent Washington, her hand hovering near her weapon from the start. The moment she drew her gun when Washington reached for his credentials, and most damning of all, her muttered comment, which the phone's sensitive microphone had picked up clearly, always trying to be something they're not. Across town at the Oak Ridge Police Department, Chief Robert Gonzalez massaged his temples as he finished watching the video for the third time. At 58, with 30 years on the force, he thought he'd seen it all. But this was a nightmare unfolding in real time. How bad is it? He asked his public information officer, who stood nervously by the door. Bad, sir. It's trending nationally now. We've got calls from CNN, Fox, MSNBC, you name it. The mayor's office has been ringing nonstop. Gonzalez sighed heavily. And the FBI? Agent Washington filed a formal complaint an hour ago. Their field office director wants a meeting with you this afternoon. Of course he does, Gonzalez muttered. He clicked play on the video again, watching Reynolds' face contort with suspicion and anger. He'd always had concerns about her, little things over the years that never quite justified serious action. A disproportionate number of complaints from minority citizens, an unusual frequency of resistance charges that later got dropped, comments in performance reviews about her rigid worldview. Get Reynolds in here and call the union rep. We're placing her on administrative leave effective immediately. She's already gone home, sir. Officer Ramirez drove her after the incident, said she was too upset to drive herself. Gonzalez stood up, straightening his uniform. Then send a car to her house. I want her badge and gun today. Officer Karen Reynolds sat on her couch, staring blankly at the TV where her own face glared back at her from the screen. The local news was playing the coffee shop video on a loop, occasionally cutting to commentary from so-called experts about police conduct and racial bias. The doorbell rang, startling her. She knew who it would be. Lieutenant David Wilson and Sergeant Patricia Ortiz stood at her door, their expressions grim. Karen, Wilson began, we need your badge and service weapon. Chief's orders. You're on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Reynolds felt oddly detached as she handed over her gun and shield. 12 years on the force, summed up in these two objects that now felt foreign in her hands. The eye. Union lawyer will contact you tomorrow, Ortiz added, her voice softer. Don't talk to the press, don't post anything online. Is that it? Reynolds asked, her voice hollow. Wilson hesitated. Karen, this doesn't look good. That FBI agent has filed a formal complaint in the video. I was doing my job. Reynolds cut in, a flash of the old defiance returning. He was suspicious. 2 phones, waiting around for hours. He was an FBI agent conducting official business, Ortiz interrupted. And you pulled your weapon on him after he identified himself. How was I supposed to know his ID was real, Reynolds? Demanded Wilson, and Ortiz exchanged glances. That's what the investigation will determine, Wilson said finally. In the meantime, stay home and stay quiet. After they left, Reynolds collapsed back onto her couch. Her phone had been buzzing nonstop. Colleagues, friends, even her mother had called twice. She ignored them all. The news had moved on to showing pictures of Agent Washington. Apparently, he was some kind of rising star in the Bureau, with commendations for community outreach work and several high-profile cases to his name. They showed a clip of him speaking at a community forum about building trust between law enforcement agencies. Reynolds turned off the TV in disgust. In his office at the FBI Field Headquarters, Agent Thomas Washington reviewed his written statement for the third time. He wanted to be thorough but objective, sticking to the facts without letting his personal feelings color the account. His supervisor, Assistant Director Gabrielle Patel, knocked on his open door. "How are you holding up?" she asked, taking a seat. Across from his desk, Washington set down his pen. "I'm fine." "You don't have to be fine, Thomas. What happened this morning was unacceptable." He nodded slightly. "It was, but it wasn't surprising." Patel studied him for a moment. "No, I suppose not. Still, having a gun pointed at you is traumatic, even for someone with your training and experience." "The worst part," Washington said, slowly, "wasn't the gun. It was knowing that nothing I could have done would have changed the outcome. From the moment she saw me, she'd decided who and what I was." "The video makes that clear," Patel agreed. "The chief of police called. He wants to meet with us this afternoon. They're putting Officer Reynolds on administrative leave." "That's just damage control. They've known who she is for years." "Maybe," Patel conceded. "But this time there's evidence. They can't ignore. The community is demanding action." Washington nodded toward his computer where dozens of emails from journalists awaited responses. "What's our position on media?" "The director wants us to coordinate with PR. This has national implications now. But," she added, leaning forward, "if you want to take a few days off, no one would question it." "I appreciate that," Washington said, "but I'd rather stay busy. My informant never showed up because of all this. That meeting needs to be rescheduled." Patel stood. "All right. But Thomas, this isn't over. Not by a long shot." At Oak Ridge City Hall, Mayor Diana Jackson was in the middle of an emergency meeting with her staff when her assistant interrupted with a note. "The governor just issued a statement," the assistant said nervously. Jackson read the note and closed her eyes briefly. "He's calling for a review of our police department's training and hiring practices." Her chief of staff winced. "That's going to make the police union unhappy." "The police union can deal with it," Jackson snapped. "I've got protesters gathering outside. The NAACP is calling for Officer Reynolds' termination, and half the city council is demanding to know how someone like her was allowed to carry a badge for 12 years. She turned to her communications director. "Draft a statement. We're launching a full investigation into both this incident and any past complaints against Officer Reynolds. We're cooperating fully with the FBI, and we're committed to transparency and accountability." "And if they ask about Reynolds specifically," the director asked. "We respect the process and won't prejudge the outcome of the investigation," Jackson replied automatically. "But privately between us, she's done. There's no coming back from this." By evening, the scene outside the Oak Ridge Police Department had transformed. What began as a small group of protesters had swelled to over 300 people. They carried signs reading, "Badge license to discriminate," and "Who polices the police?" Their chants echoed against the brick facade of the building. Among them was Diego Martinez, a community organizer who had been working on police reform issues for years. "This isn't just about one officer," he told the crowd through a megaphone. "This is about a system that protected her despite years of complaints from people in our community. How many times were people of color harassed by Officer Reynolds before she happened to pick on someone with enough power to fight back?" The crowd roared in response. Inside the police station, Officer Joe Ramirez watched the protest through the window, his expression troubled. The day's events kept replaying in his mind. The look on Reynolds' face when she drew her weapon, the calm composure of Agent Washington, the horrified expressions of the coffee shop customers. "Quite a mess," said a voice behind him. Officer Miguel Santos, a 20-year veteran, joined him at the window. "I should have stepped in sooner," Ramirez said quietly. "I knew something was off with Karen for a long time. We all did." Santos shrugged. "What could you have done? Written her up for bad attitude?" You know how that goes. I could have reported the comments she made, the way she treated certain people during traffic stops, and become a pariah in the department? Santos shook his head. The blue wall of silence is real, man. Nobody wants to be a rat. Ramirez turned to face him. And look where that got us. Look where it got her. Santos had no answer for that. Later that night, as Ramirez drove home, he passed by Sunrise Coffee. The place was closed, but someone had placed flowers and candles outside, as if marking the spot of a tragedy. In a way, he supposed it was. Not just for Reynolds, whose career was almost certainly over, but for everyone who had trusted her with a badge and gun despite the warning signs. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife. You on the news again? Whole thing crazy. You okay? He wasn't sure how to answer that. The department would weather this storm. New policies would be implemented, sensitivity training mandated, body cameras checked more frequently. But would anything really change? As he pulled into his driveway, Ramirez made a decision. Tomorrow he would ask to speak with Internal Affairs. There were things about Karen Reynolds, incidents he'd witnessed, comments she'd made, that they needed to know. It wouldn't be easy, and some of his colleagues would never forgive him. But silence had protected the wrong people for too long. He texted his wife back. Not okay yet, but maybe getting there. A week after the coffee shop incident, the Oak Ridge Police Department's Internal Affairs Division had taken over the third-floor conference room as their command center. The walls were covered with printouts, timelines, and photographs, all focused on Officer Karen Reynolds. Captain Gloria Vasquez, head of Internal Affairs, stood in front of the evidence board, coffee in hand. At 52, she'd investigated dozens of officer misconduct cases, but few had garnered this level of public attention. What have we got from her personnel file? She asked her team. Lieutenant Richard Dawson flipped open a thick folder. 12 years of service, 4 commendations, for valor, but also 17 civilian complaints, 9 of which came from minority citizens claiming harassment or excessive force. And how many of those complaints were sustained? Vasquez already knew the answer. None, Dawson admitted. Most were dismissed, as unfounded or resolved with counseling. Vasquez sipped her coffee, grimacing at both its bitterness and the information. So we've got a pattern that nobody acted on. What about social media? Detective Alicia Diaz pulled up several screenshots on her laptop. Nothing overtly racist on her public profiles, but we subpoenaed her private messages with other officers. That's where things get ugly. She turned the screen so Vasquez could see. The captain's expression hardened as she read through the exchanges. Jokes about minorities, derogatory terms, complaints about diversity hires in the department. Who was she messaging with? Vasquez asked. That's the other problem, Diaz said. At least 6 other officers were part of these conversations, including Sergeant Miller from the training division. Vasquez set down her coffee. We're going to need a bigger board. In her small apartment, Reynolds sat across from Union Attorney Greg Sullivan. At 65, Sullivan had represented police officers for over 30 years. He'd seen everything, from brutality cases to corruption charges. But the look on his face told Reynolds this wasn't going well. They've got your text messages, Sullivan said flatly. The ones with Miller and the others? Reynolds felt the blood drain from her face. Those were private conversations. Between police officers using department-issued phones, Sullivan corrected. There's no expectation of privacy there, and you know it. So what does this mean? Sullivan removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. It means your defense just got a lot harder. We were going to argue that you were following protocol with a suspicious individual, that you had no way of immediately verifying his identity. But these messages establish a pattern of bias. Those were just jokes, Reynolds protested. Dark, humor, every cop does it. No, Sullivan said sharply. Every cop does not, and a jury won't see them as jokes. They'll see them as evidence that you viewed certain groups with contempt and suspicion. Reynolds slumped back in her chair. So what do we do? At this point, I think we need to consider a resignation agreement. If we can negotiate terms, resign. Reynolds sat up straight. After 12 years? No way. I was doing my job. Sullivan replaced his glasses and gathered his papers. Karen, listen to me carefully. This isn't just about your job anymore. The FBI is considering federal civil rights charges. The district attorney is looking at criminal charges for assault with a deadly weapon and unlawful detention. The best outcome right now is a resignation that lets you keep your pension and avoids criminal prosecution. Reynolds stared at him, the reality of her situation finally sinking in. This is all because of that video, isn't it? If that girl hadn't been recording, if you hadn't pulled your gun on a federal agent because of the color of his skin, Sullivan interrupted, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Reynolds had no response to that. At FBI headquarters, Agent Washington scrolled through another batch of interview requests from news outlets across the country. CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, The New York Times. They all wanted his story. His phone rang. It was Gabrielle Patel. The Oak Ridge police chief just called, she said without preamble. They've uncovered a trove of text messages between Reynolds and other officers. Explicitly racist content. Washington wasn't surprised. So it wasn't just me. No. And it wasn't just Reynolds. There's evidence of a broader culture problem in certain units. Washington leaned back in his chair. What happens now? Their internal affairs is expanding the investigation to include the other officers involved. As for Reynolds specifically, they're building a case for termination. The union will fight it, of course, but with the texts and the video, they don't have much leverage. And the community response? Growing, Patel said. The protests have been peaceful but persistent. Civil rights groups are calling for a Justice Department pattern or practice investigation of the entire department. Washington thought for a moment. That's needed, but it won't address the deeper issues. Which is why the director wants you to consider taking a more public role in this, Patel said carefully. Not just as the victim of Reynolds' actions, but as a voice for reform. I'm not a spokesperson, Washington objected. No, but you're uniquely positioned at the intersection of this case, a black federal agent mistreated by local police. Your perspective carries weight. Washington stared out his office window, watching people go about their daily lives below. I'll think about it. Officer Joe Ramirez sat uncomfortably in the internal affairs interview room. He'd come forward, voluntarily, but that didn't make this any easier. Just to be clear, Captain Vasquez said, you're not under investigation at this time. We're gathering information about Officer Reynolds and the departmental culture. Ramirez nodded. I understand. You partnered with Reynolds for 3 years. During that time, did you witness her treat minorities differently than white citizens? Ramirez took a deep breath. Yes, she was harsher with them, more suspicious, quicker to escalate situations. Can you give specific examples? For the next hour, Ramirez detailed incidents he'd witnessed. Traffic stops where Reynolds had immediately ordered black or Latino drivers out of their vehicles for minor violations. Comments she'd made after arrests. The way she'd ignore calls from certain neighborhoods if she could. Did you ever report any of this? Vasquez asked. No, Ramirez admitted, shame evident in his voice. I told myself it wasn't my place to judge her, that maybe she had experiences I didn't have that made her more cautious. But you didn't believe that, did you? Ramirez looked down at his hands. No, I knew it was wrong. But reporting another officer, you know how that goes. Unfortunately, I do, Vasquez said. One more question, Officer Ramirez. Were you part of the text message group with Reynolds, Miller, and the others? No, he said firmly. I knew they had a private chat, but I wasn't invited. I think they knew I wouldn't participate in that kind of talk. Vasquez nodded, making a note. Thank you for coming forward now, Officer Ramirez. It couldn't have been easy. It's not enough, Ramirez said quietly. I should have done something sooner. At Sunrise Coffee, business was booming. The shop had become something of a landmark. Overnight, people came from all over the city, some just to take selfies at the table where the confrontation had happened. The owner, Michael Torres, had mixed feelings about the sudden popularity. While the increased revenue was welcome, it had come at a disturbing price. He was wiping down the counter when Lily Chen, the student who had recorded the video, walked in. "Hey," she said, approaching the counter. "Just wanted a regular coffee, today." Torres nodded, preparing her drink. "How are you holding up? Must be strange having your video everywhere." Lily shrugged. "Kind of overwhelming. I've gotten hundreds of messages, some thanking me, some calling me terrible names for attacking the police." "People see what they want to see," Torres said, handing her the coffee. "For what it's worth, I think you did the right thing." "Keep thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't recorded it," Lily said. "Would anyone have believed what happened? Would Officer Reynolds still be out there with a badge and gun?" Torres had no answer for her. They both knew the likely truth. As Lily found a seat, the bell above the door jingled. Agent Washington walked in, drawing immediate attention from the other customers. He'd been recognized everywhere since the video went viral. He ordered a simple black coffee and, after a moment's hesitation, approached Lily's table. "Ms. Chen?" he asked. "I'm Agent Washington. I wanted to thank you in person." Lily looked up surprised. You're welcome. I just did what seemed right." "What seems right isn't always easy," Washington said. "Your video made sure this incident couldn't be swept under the rug." "Has that happened before?" Lily asked. "To you, I mean?" Washington considered his answer carefully. "Not exactly like this, but there have been assumptions, moments where I had to work twice as hard to prove my authority or credentials." He glanced around the coffee shop, aware of the eyes on them. "The difference this time is that everyone can see it, and that creates an opportunity for change." Lily nodded slowly. "Do you think anything will actually change, though?" "Some things already have," Washington said. "One officer is facing consequences. Others are being investigated. People are talking about issues they preferred to ignore before. But systemic change takes more than one viral video," Lily pointed out. Washington smiled slightly. "You're right about that, which is why what happens next matters so much." As he left the coffee shop, Washington's phone buzzed with a text from Patel. "Oak Ridge PD scheduling disciplinary hearing for Reynolds next week. They want you to testify." Washington typed his response without hesitation. "I'll be there." The morning of the disciplinary hearing arrived with a sense of grim inevitability. Police headquarters had been cordoned off, with barricades keeping protesters and media at a safe distance. Officers in uniform stood at attention, their faces impassive as chants rose from the crowd. Inside, the hearing room had been prepared, with all the somber formality of a courtroom. A long table faced forward, where the 5-member disciplinary board would sit. To the left, another table for Reynolds and her union attorney. To the right, a table for internal affairs and department, counsel. Captain Vasquez arrived early, spreading her files across the table with methodical precision. She'd barely slept the night before, reviewing every detail of the case against Officer Reynolds. It wasn't just about one incident anymore. The coffee shop confrontation had merely been the thread that, when pulled, unraveled a 12-year history of troubling behavior. The door opened and Reynolds entered with Greg Sullivan. She wore her dress uniform, pressed and perfect, though she hadn't been allowed to wear it on duty since being placed on administrative leave. Her face was a careful mask, betraying nothing. Sullivan nodded briefly to Vasquez. There would be no friendly chatter today. Both knew what was at stake. By 9 o'clock, the room had filled. The disciplinary board, 3 senior officers and 2 civilian oversight committee members, filed in solemnly. Chief Gonzalez sat in the back, observing but not participating. This was a matter for the board now. Captain Howard Chen, the most senior officer on the board, called the hearing to order. "This disciplinary hearing is now in session. We are here to review the conduct of Officer Karen Reynolds regarding the incident at Sunrise Coffee on April 15th, as well as other matters that have come to light during the subsequent investigation." He turned to Reynolds. "Officer Reynolds, you have been served with the formal charges against you. They include excessive use of force, conduct unbecoming an officer, racial bias in the performance of duties, and making false statements in official reports. Do you understand these charges? Reynolds stood. Yes, sir. And how do you respond to these charges? Sullivan rose. Captain Chen, if I may, we'd like to enter a general denial at this time, with the understanding that we'll address each charge, specifically as evidence is presented. Chen nodded. So noted. Captain Vasquez, you may begin. Vasquez stood, her expression grave but determined. Members of the board, this case began with a single incident that was captured on video and witnessed by numerous citizens. But as our investigation progressed, it became clear that this was not an isolated occurrence, but rather the culmination of a pattern of behavior spanning Officer Reynolds's 12-year career. For the next hour, Vasquez methodically laid out the case. She played the coffee shop video in its entirety. She presented Reynolds' text messages, displaying them on a large screen for all to see. She called Officer Ramirez to testify about what he had witnessed as Reynolds' partner. Throughout it all, Reynolds sat stone-faced, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Only the whitening of her knuckles betrayed her tension. When Agent Washington entered the room, a hushed silence fell. He wore his FBI credentials on a lanyard around his neck and carried himself with quiet dignity. After being sworn in, he recounted the events at the coffee shop in precise, measured terms. At any point, Vasquez asked, did Officer Reynolds give you a reasonable opportunity to identify yourself before drawing her weapon? No, Washington replied. I attempted to reach for my credentials when asked, moving slowly and stating my intention to do so. That's when she drew her weapon. And what did she say when you identified yourself as an FBI agent? She expressed disbelief and made a comment implying that someone like me couldn't be an FBI agent. Someone like you? Vasquez prompted. A black man, Washington clarified, his voice steady. Sullivan rose for cross-examination. Agent Washington, isn't it true that you were in plain clothes, not in any kind of uniform that would identify you as law enforcement? That's correct. I was working undercover. And you had 2 phones on the table, were watching people coming and going, and had been there for an unusual length of time, correct? I was conducting surveillance, yes. So from Officer Reynolds's perspective, might your behavior have appeared suspicious? Washington considered this. Initial caution would be warranted, but once I identified myself and attempted to show credentials, the appropriate response would have been to allow me to do so safely, not to escalate by drawing a weapon. Sullivan pressed on, trying to create reasonable doubt, but Washington remained unshakable. When he was finally dismissed, many in the room felt the last hope for Reynolds' defense had walked out with him. After a short recess, it was Reynolds' turn to speak. She took the stand, visibly nervous but still defiant. Officer Reynolds, Sullivan, began gently, please tell the board in your own words what happened that day at Sunrise Coffee. Reynolds cleared her throat. I received a call about a suspicious person. When I arrived, the subject matched the description, a man who had been there for hours, watching people with 2 phones. In my experience, that's consistent with drug dealing or other criminal activity. And when he reached toward his pocket, I perceived a potential threat and drew my weapon. Following my training, officer safety is paramount. What about when he claimed to be an FBI agent? Anyone can claim to be anything, Reynolds said. I've encountered people with fake badges before. I was waiting for verification. Vasquez rose for her cross-examination, her expression stern. Officer Reynolds, let's talk about these text messages you exchanged with other officers. The screen behind her lit up with one of the more egregious examples. Reynolds flinched visibly. Did you write this message referring to black citizens? In your patrol area as, and I quote, animals who need to be kept in check? A long pause. It was just venting. Dark humor. Is racial prejudice humorous to you, Officer Reynolds? No, What about this message where you complained about having to babysit another diversity hire during training? Was that also just humor? Reynolds' composure began to crack. You're taking things out of context. Then please provide the context in which these statements would be acceptable from a sworn officer. Reynolds had no answer. For another hour, Vasquez methodically dismantled Reynolds' defense, presenting complaint after complaint from minority citizens, all dismissed over the years. She showed traffic stop statistics revealing that Reynolds searched vehicles driven by minorities at 3 times the rate of those driven by white drivers. By the time Reynolds stepped down, her face was flushed and her hands shaking. In closing argument, Sullivan did his best, arguing that Reynolds was a product of her training and environment, that the department bore some responsibility for failing to address issues earlier, that one incident shouldn't end a 12-year career. Vasquez was brief but devastating. Officer Reynolds has demonstrated through words and actions over many years that she cannot serve all citizens equally. The badge requires not just physical courage but moral courage and integrity. She has failed that test repeatedly. The board retired to deliberate, leaving Reynolds and Sullivan alone at their table. "How bad will it be?" Reynolds asked quietly. Sullivan sighed. "Termination is likely. The question is whether they'll refer the case to the district attorney for criminal charges." Reynolds closed her eyes. Her career, her identity, her life as she knew it, all hanging in the balance. Outside, as the sun began to set, the protesters remained. Their signs glowed in the fading light. "Justice for all," and "Hold police accountable," and "Who do you serve?" Among them stood Lily Chen, the student whose video had started it all. She'd come straight from classes, joining the vigil for justice. Beside her unexpectedly stood Michael Torres, the coffee shop owner. "Any news?" he asked. Lily shook her head. "Still deliberating, but I heard Agent Washington testified." Torres nodded. "Good." His voice needed to be heard. "Do you think it will make a difference?" Lily asked. "Not just for Reynolds, but for everything else?" Torres looked at the police headquarters, its windows glowing in the dusk. "One case won't fix a broken system, but sometimes you need a crack to let the light in." Inside, the board members filed back into the hearing room. Reynolds and Sullivan stood. Captain Chen's face gave nothing away as he took his seat. "Officer Karen Reynolds," he began. "After reviewing all evidence and testimony, this board has reached a unanimous decision." The room held its collective breath. "On all charges, we find the evidence sustains the allegations. The appropriate discipline in this case is termination from the Oak Ridge Police Department, effective immediately." A murmur ran through the room. Reynolds swayed slightly, Sullivan's hand steadying her elbow. "Furthermore," Chen continued, "we are referring our findings to the district attorney's office for review of potential criminal charges. This hearing is adjourned." The gavel fell with a finality that echoed through the room. 12 years of service ended with that sound. As Reynolds was led out, her face blank with shock, Chief Gonzalez approached Washington, who had returned to hear the verdict. "Agent Washington," Gonzalez said, extending his hand, "I want to apologize, personally, for what happened to you in our city." Washington shook his hand. "Chief, the apology is appreciated, but what happens next matters more." "I know," Gonzalez nodded. "This isn't the end. We've got 6 other officers implicated in those text messages. We're reviewing every complaint filed against them, and I'm bringing in outside consultants to evaluate our training and policies." "It's a start," Washington acknowledged. Outside, word of the decision spread through the crowd. There were cheers, but also a somber recognition that one officer's termination wouldn't solve the deeper problems. As the night grew darker, candles were lit, points of light in the gathering gloom. A vigil for justice that remained incomplete, but perhaps a little closer than before. 3 months after the disciplinary hearing, Oak Ridge was a city in transition. The summer heat had settled over the streets, but the atmosphere remained charged, with both tension and possibility. Karen Reynolds' termination had been just the beginning. In the weeks that followed, 4 other officers implicated in the text message scandal had resigned rather than face disciplinary hearings. Sergeant Miller, who had supervised training for new recruits, was suspended pending his own hearing. The police union, which had initially defended Reynolds vigorously, had grown noticeably quieter as more evidence emerged. The district attorney had ultimately declined to file criminal charges against Reynolds, citing the difficulty of proving criminal intent beyond reasonable doubt. The decision had sparked fresh protests, but Reynolds hadn't escaped consequences entirely. The FBI's Civil Rights Division had opened an investigation, and 3 former arrestees had filed civil lawsuits against both Reynolds and the department. On to a warm Thursday morning, Agent Thomas Washington pulled into the parking lot of the Oak Ridge Community Center. The building had been transformed into a temporary headquarters for what local media had dubbed the Police Reform Task Force, a coalition of law enforcement officials, civil rights advocates, community leaders, and outside experts. Washington checked his reflection in the rearview mirror, straightening his tie. Today wasn't just another meeting. Today they would be presenting their preliminary findings and recommendations to the city council. Inside, the main hall buzzed with activity. Chairs had been arranged in a semicircle, facing a podium and projection screen. Mayor Diana Jackson stood near the entrance, deep in conversation with Chief Gonzalez. Both looked up as Washington entered. "Agent Washington," the mayor greeted him, extending her hand. "Thank you for coming today." "Of course," Washington replied. "I wouldn't miss it." Gonzalez's handshake was firmer than usual, his expression determined. The past months had aged him visibly, but there was a new resolve in his bearing. "The Justice Department called this morning," he told Washington quietly. "They're expanding their investigation to include our hiring practices going back 10 years. Washington nodded. "That was expected. They'll be thorough." "Good," Gonzalez said, surprising Washington. "We need to know how deep this goes if we're going to fix it." More people filed in, council members, community organizers, journalists. Washington spotted Officer Joe Ramirez, now promoted to detective and assigned to community outreach. Nearby sat Lily Chen, whose video had catalyzed the entire process. She'd become something of a local hero, and had recently been appointed to the Civilian Police Oversight Committee. Washington made his way to the front row, where Gabrielle Patel was saving him a seat. "Nervous?" she asked as he sat down. "A little," he admitted. "This is not what I expected to be doing 3 months ago." "You've done good work here," Patel said. "The director is impressed." Before Washington could respond, Mayor Jackson called the meeting to order. "Thank you all for coming today." 3 months ago, our city faced a crisis of trust. A single incident exposed deeper problems within our police department, problems that many in our community had been pointing out for years, but that too many of us failed to take seriously. She gestured to the assembled task force members. These dedicated individuals have spent countless hours reviewing policies, interviewing officers and citizens, and studying best practices from around the country. Today, they'll present their findings and recommendations. This is just the beginning of our journey, but it's an important step. She turned to Washington. "Agent Washington, as co-chair of the task force, would you begin?" Washington approached the podium, feeling the weight of all eyes upon him. When the FBI had first asked him to take a public role in Oak Ridge's reform efforts, he'd been reluctant. He was an investigator, not an activist. But as he'd become more involved, he'd realized that his unique position, respected both within law enforcement and by the community, allowed him to bridge gaps that others couldn't. "Thank you, Mayor Jackson," he began. "Our task force was charged with a difficult mission, to identify what went wrong, not just in one incident, but in the system that allowed that incident to occur, and more importantly, to recommend concrete steps to ensure it doesn't happen again." He clicked to the first slide of their presentation. "We identified 5 key areas that need immediate attention: recruitment and hiring, training, supervision, accountability, and community engagement. I'll outline our findings in each area, and then my colleagues will detail our specific recommendations." For the next hour, Washington and other task force members took turns explaining their work. They didn't sugarcoat the problems they'd found: a hiring process that failed to screen for bias, training that emphasized force over de-escalation, supervisors who ignored warning signs, complaint procedures that protected officers over citizens, and community engagement that was more photo opportunity than genuine partnership. But they also presented solutions, psychological screening tools, to identify bias in recruits, revised training protocols focused on communication and cultural competence, enhanced supervisory responsibilities with regular review of officer conduct, an overhauled complaint process with civilian oversight, and community advisory boards, with real input into department policies. When they finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then Mayor Jackson returned to the podium. "These are challenging recommendations," she acknowledged. "Implementing them will require significant resources and commitment. But I believe they represent our best path forward. The City Council will review this report in detail, but I want to express my personal support for these reforms." She turned to Chief Gonzalez. "Chief, would you like to respond?" Gonzalez stood, his expression solemn. 3 months ago, when the video of Officer Reynolds pointing her weapon at Agent Washington went viral, many people assumed I would deny the problem or try to minimize it. That's what police leadership has often done in these situations. He paused, looking around the room. But I couldn't do that, not just because the evidence was undeniable, but because I knew in my heart that we had failed. Failed our community, failed our good officers, and failed in our duty to serve and protect everyone equally. His voice grew stronger. "I support these recommendations without reservation. Some of my officers won't like them. Some community members may think they don't go far enough, but they represent a genuine commitment to change, and I pledge my full cooperation in implementing them." The press conference that followed was a blur of questions and cameras. Washington answered as many as he could, carefully emphasizing that reform was a process, not an event. When it was finally over, he stepped outside for some air. He found Lily Chen sitting on a bench near the building entrance. "That was something," she said as he approached. "Do you think it will work?" Washington sat beside her. "Some of it will, some of it won't, but it's a start." "Is that enough?" she pressed. Washington considered her question seriously. "When I first joined the FBI, I thought changing things from the inside would be easier. It's not. Systems resist change. People resist change. But sometimes, when the right people push at the right moment." He gestured to the community center, behind them, where city officials were still discussing the recommendations. "This wouldn't have happened without your video. One person with the courage to document what they saw." Lily shook her head. "I just held up my phone. You're the one who stood your ground when she pointed a gun at you, and now we're both part of what comes next," Washington said. As if on cue, his phone buzzed with a text from Patel. "Just heard from Justice Dept. They want you to help coordinate the expanded investigation." He showed Lily the message. "See? What comes next?" Later that evening, Washington drove past Sunrise Coffee on his way out of town. The shop had become something of a landmark, not just of the incident that sparked Oak Ridge's reforms, but of the community's response to it. Someone had painted a mural on the side of the building, hands of different colors passing a coffee cup from one to another. Simple but powerful. He thought about Reynolds, now working as a security guard in a neighboring county. Her lawsuit against the department for wrongful termination had been dismissed last week. He felt no satisfaction in her downfall, only a somber recognition that one person's biases had finally caught up with them. Washington's phone rang through his car speakers. It was the FBI director. "Agent Washington," the director said, "I've been following your work in Oak Ridge. The Attorney General is impressed with how you've handled a difficult situation." "Thank you, sir. We're establishing a new unit focused on police reform coordination across multiple jurisdictions. Your experience would be valuable. Would you be interested in heading it up?" Washington thought about the offer. 3 months ago, he'd been focused on his casework, on moving up the traditional FBI career ladder. This new path would be different, more public, more political, more challenging in many ways, but also, perhaps, more meaningful. "Yes, sir," he said finally. "I would." As he drove away from Oak Ridge, Washington reflected on how a single moment had changed so many lives, his own included. One confrontation in a coffee shop had revealed the cracks in a system, had forced people to see what had been there all along. Change wouldn't come easily or quickly. The reforms proposed today might be watered down tomorrow. Some officers would resist. Some community members would remain skeptical. The path forward would be neither straight nor smooth. But for the first time in a long time, there was a path. And sometimes that was enough to begin the journey.